January 1949, North Dakota. A Caterpillar D8 is pushing into a black snowdrift taller than its blade, with no clear road, no fence line, and no horizon left to follow. Behind that drift are cut-off towns, stranded farms, and a state starting to lose contact with itself. To understand why North Dakota needed Caterpillar D8s just to keep parts of the state connected, you have to go back to the winter of 1948 into 1949, when the Northern Plains entered one of the most punishing weather sequences in American history. This was not a single storm and then recovery. It was a season of repeated burial. Snow came early, wind came harder, and every open mile of prairie turned into a machine for moving snow exactly where roads, rail lines, farm lanes, and town approaches could least afford it. The geography mattered. North Dakota offered almost no natural protection. Large sections of the state were broad, exposed agricultural country, flat enough for wind to build speed over long distances, and uninterrupted enough for drifting snow to travel far beyond where it first fell. In those conditions, snowfall totals alone did not explain the disaster. Wind did. A road might be opened in daylight and gone again by nightfall. A cut made through a drift in the morning could be filled before the crew returned with fuel. On paper, this looked like a snow removal problem. On the ground, it was a continuous battle against transport, compaction, and visibility. Then came the phenomenon people across the region remembered as black snow. The name was not poetic. It described what happened when violent winds stripped dark topsoil from exposed fields and drove it into the storm itself. Snow falling or drifting across that soil became stained gray, brown, and in places nearly black. What should have looked like a clean winter landscape instead took on the color of ash, coal, and frozen mud. It reduced contrast, hid drift edges, and turned open country into something visually wrong even before the roads disappeared. For crews trying to move through it, black snow was not only eerie, it was practical trouble. The surface layers could be denser, dirtier, and harder packed than ordinary drifted snow, with a crust that broke differently under a blade. By January 1949, rail service was failing across parts of the Northern Plains. Highways vanished. Rural communities were cut off. Livestock feed ran low in isolated areas. Medical access became uncertain. Schoolhouses, farmsteads, and small towns were not facing inconvenience. They were facing duration. The real question was not whether one storm could be survived. It was how long roads could remain closed before fuel, food, mail, medicine, and emergency movement all began to fail at once. That is where the machine story begins. Highway departments and local crews had snowplows, truck-mounted equipment, graders, and older municipal gear. But repeated blizzard conditions exposed the limits of lighter snow equipment very quickly. Trucks depended on roads still existing beneath them. Graders could windrow and cut, but once drifts deepened, hardened, and spread across full right-of-way width, traction and weight became limiting factors. The problem was no longer plowing snowfall. It was breaking through wind-built masses that behaved more like packed material than fresh snow. On paper, a Caterpillar D8 was not a snowplow in the municipal sense. It was a heavy crawler tractor built for earth-moving, drawbar work, and sustained pushing under load. But those same traits made it one of the few machines that could still function when conventional road equipment had already reached its limit. A late 1940s D8 brought weight, track flotation, low-speed pushing force, and the ability to keep moving in conditions that would stop wheeled machines outright. With blade fitted, these tractors pushed into drifts by brute mechanical advantage, not speed. In a North Dakota whiteout, that distinction mattered. Mechanically, the advantage was simple. Tracks spread machine weight over a larger contact area than tires, reducing the chance of immediate sink-in on soft or drifted surfaces, while preserving traction on packed layers below. The diesel engine delivered steady torque at low ground speed, exactly what a machine needed when the blade met snow that had been compacted by repeated wind loading into a wall rather than a bank. The D8 was fighting physics, not just winter. It had to shear, lift, and shove material that could collapse loose in one section and lock solid in the next. But even the D8 had limits, and those limits were shaped by the plains themselves. In mountain snow work, terrain narrows the fight. In North Dakota, the danger was exposure. There were few visual references in open country once fence lines disappeared and ditches filled level with the road crown. Operators could lose the road completely while still moving in the correct general direction. A machine that strayed off the grade might drop into a buried ditch, tip into a culvert line, or spend precious fuel cutting a path across the wrong field. The machine was powerful enough to push snow. That did not mean the operator could always see where the road still was. Crews learned quickly that this was not ordinary winter maintenance. Progress had to be organized in sectors, often with local knowledge guiding every mile. Men who knew where a township road bent around a farmstead, where a bridge approach narrowed, where telegraph poles marked a rail crossing, and where a drainage cut could trap a crawler, became as important as the machine itself. In some areas, opening a route was less about speed than about not losing the route entirely. A D8 could force a passage. It could not guess buried geometry. The state's need was immediate and layered. Main highways had to be reopened where possible, but branch roads mattered too because North Dakota's economy still depended on dispersed farms, elevators, stockyards, and rail points. A road left closed too long did not only isolate residents, it interrupted feed delivery, milk hauling, livestock movement, and access to rail shipment. Snow became an infrastructure failure, one drift at a time. The work of the dozers was not glamorous, it was connective tissue. If they broke one lane through, trucks, ambulances, utility crews, and supply convoys had a chance, and the timing made everything harder. Repeated storms meant crews were often reopening roads that had already been opened before. Fuel, maintenance hours, and operator endurance all accumulated across the season. Cold affected starting, lubrication, visibility, and human judgment. Wind erased work almost as fast as work was completed. Then, the margin disappeared. In parts of North Dakota, the operation changed from clearing roads to preserving lifelines. Now back to the machines. When Caterpillar D8s moved into black snow country during the 1949 blizzard crisis, they were not arriving for cleanup after the fact. They were being sent into an active, recurring weather disaster where every mile opened had to be defended against the next wind. The question was no longer whether a bulldozer could move snow. It was whether steel, diesel, and track could hold open a path long enough for the state behind it to keep breathing. The answer came mile by mile, and never cleanly. Once the D8s were committed, crews began opening priority corridors first. Approaches to stranded towns, rail connections, supply roads, and highway segments where ordinary plows had already failed repeatedly. In open country, the dozer usually worked ahead of everything else. Its job was not to finish the road. Its job was to create the road again. Behind it came graders, trucks, and whatever lighter equipment could widen, dress, and hold the cut before the wind rebuilt the drift. The work was slow because the drifts were not uniform. Some were loose surface accumulations the blade could roll aside in long white curls. Others had been packed by days of wind into dense walls that resisted like wet fill. Operators learned to read them by blade feel and engine note. A drift that looked passable from 50 yards away could stop the tractor dead at first contact if the snow beneath the crust had compacted into layered hardness. On paper, the D8 had enough tractor for the job. On the ground, each drift had to be tested. When the blade met a heavy-set drift, the method changed. Operators did not always try to take the full height at once. They cut in lifts, shaving the upper section, backing, then driving again to lower the face. If the machine tried to take too much, snow spilled over the blade, rolled back under the tracks, and robbed the tractor of momentum. In the worst sections, the problem was no longer pushing volume. It was keeping the machine from building its own trap. Visibility remained the constant threat. In black snow conditions, The road edges could vanish into a gray-brown blur with almost no tonal separation between ditch, drift, and field. Fence posts, utility poles, and section line markers became navigation instruments. A man walking ahead or riding a second machine could matter more than horsepower. If the dozer dropped one track into a buried roadside depression, the recovery itself could cost hours, and in that wind, hours were enough to lose the cut entirely. That is why the operators mattered as much as the tractors. A D8 could push with enormous force, but force without judgment was expensive. The men in those seats had to decide when to hit a drift straight on, when to angle off, when to reverse before the machine bellied out, and when a route was too far gone to waste fuel until support arrived behind them. The machine was not making those decisions. The operator was, often in blowing snow, with limited visibility, no easy turnaround, and communities waiting beyond the drift line. Mechanically, the tractors were being asked to do winter work far outside the kind of clean brochure image manufacturers preferred. Fine snow packed into track frames, ice formed where melt and refreeze caught around rollers and idlers, cold thickened lubricants, slowed hydraulic response where equipped, and punished every start. Engines had to be warmed carefully before taking full blade load. A dozer that was worked too hard too soon in that temperature could lose more than time. It could lose a day to repairs the state could not afford. Fuel logistics became part of the operation. Opening roads across scattered prairie meant the machines were often working away from fixed shops and heated service points. Every gallon burned had to be planned against distance, reclosure risk, and the chance that the machine might have to fight its own way back out. Maintenance crews improvised in the cold, servicing what they could in field conditions because hauling a disabled crawler out of a drifted road sector was its own campaign, and yet the D8s kept moving. They opened one-lane cuts where there had been nothing. They broke access to farm districts that had gone days without reliable connection. They reached corridors where trucks could finally follow with feed, mail, medical supplies, and fuel. In some districts, the dozer was the first proof that the outside world was still coming. The road behind it might still be narrow, rough, and vulnerable to the next blow, but it existed again, and that changed everything. The reason matters. The D8 did not beat the blizzard in any final sense. No machine did. What it did was restore enough movement, enough, often enough, to prevent meteorology from becoming complete isolation. That is the distinction. The machine was not clearing winter for comfort. It was keeping a transportation network from disappearing altogether. By late winter and into the spring break, the black snow crisis left behind more than photographs of buried farmsteads and drifted rail lines. It left an operational lesson written in steel and diesel. In severe plains blizzard conditions, conventional snow equipment could maintain roads only while roads still retained their shape. Once wind erased that shape and built drifts beyond blade truck capacity, heavy crawler tractors became recovery machines for the transportation system itself. They were no longer part of routine maintenance. They were emergency infrastructure. That lesson stayed with highway departments across the northern plains. Later snow emergencies would still rely on plows and graders first, but the memory of what tracked bulldozers could do in total drift conditions remained. Weight, flotation, low-speed push, and operator discipline had proven their value where speed and wheels had failed. The machine had shown exactly where brute force became necessary, and exactly how much local knowledge still had to accompany it. The roads did reopen, but not as a single dramatic moment. They reopened in fragments, then sectors, then longer connected stretches as weather eased and crews widened what the dozers had first cut through. Town by town, the state stitched itself back together. Rail service recovered where lines could be reached. Farm movement resumed where drifts were finally broken back from crossings and approaches. The visual drama belonged to the storms. The actual rescue belonged to the long, repetitive work after them. Today, the winter of 1949 is still remembered across the northern plains for its scale, its cruelty, and the strange darkness of black snow moving over white ground. But machine history remembers something more specific. It remembers the moment heavy crawler tractors stopped being seen as merely construction equipment and became, under the right conditions, instruments of civil survival. The Caterpillar D8s sent into North Dakota did not leave monuments behind. They left open lanes, fuel tracks, widened cuts, and a season's worth of decisions that kept remote communities connected long enough to endure. Their work disappeared as the snow melted. The consequence did not. The prairie looked empty again when spring finally came. Fence lines reappeared. Ditches took their old shape. Roads that had vanished under drifting black snow returned to being ordinary county routes and state highways. But for one winter, those roads had to be rebuilt by crawler tractor, one blade width at a time. That is why this machine still matters. If you appreciate machine history told at ground level, subscribe. And if you have worked snow operations, rural road maintenance, or tracked equipment in winter conditions, tell us what stands out to you here, because this would not be the last time a bulldozer had to do a snowplow's job.